Welcome. This series promotes informal learning to offer a flexible but impactful way for our 4-H agents and staff to support the heart of every 4-H program, its volunteers. Each video in this series will give an overview of key concepts that 4-H professionals need to successfully grow, manage, and sustain a volunteer program. But I'm not just going to tell you about it. Each series is packed with tools and resources to help you implement them in a practical way. And all of this is available on demand, ready when you are, but I do recommend that you be intentional about blocking time each month to watch the videos, explore the tools, and most importantly, plan to incorporate them into your volunteer practice, because if you don't use them, then it's not going to help. Now, at the end of the video, you will be asked to take a short feedback survey, and your feedback will help me keep the series relevant and justify my time. At the end of the form, you will be redirected to a website where you can download all of the tools and resources shared in this video. Now, this series came about through a needs assessment that we did at a recent 4-H program implementation team retreat. And so this is one of the outcomes of that retreat and part of our overall professional development plan for the Northwest District. The overall goal of this series is to equip 4-H faculty and staff with the knowledge, skills, and tools to manage an exceptional volunteer program at the county level. So many of you asked about support for volunteer recruitment, training, recognition, and retention. So this is how we're going to do that. So specifically, we want to develop volunteer programs that align with the mission of our organization while also meeting the unique needs of your county in a way that is sustainable. Each topic is going to be aligned with both the 4-H Professional Research, Knowledge, and Competencies Framework, as well as the ICETUR model for volunteer administration, and the framework that the Council for Certification of Volunteer Managers uses. And this is important because Extension is a research-based organization, so we really need to be practicing what we preach in our daily approach to programming. So sessions will be released on a monthly basis for a total of 12, and this video specifically addresses personal and organizational readiness for volunteer engagement. Now, I do have a recommendation on how to approach this series. If you are new to mid-career, so maybe you have 10 years or less of experience with 4-H, I would plan to participate in the entire series. This will help you build a really strong foundation for volunteer management. Now, if you've been around a while, like me, and you are more of a mid-career to seasoned professional, I recommend taking the assessment. Anyone can take it. You don't have to be a mid to seasoned career person, but take this assessment. There's a QR code on the screen. This will help you figure out where your strengths and weaknesses are. And that way you can really focus on the topics that are the most challenging to you. So at the end of the assessment, you'll answer the questions based on your knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs. And then you will hit submit, and it will give you your scores, and it tells you kind of, what to do with those scores. And so in this example, this individual scored really high for personal readiness, so they may not watch this video, but it looks like identification of volunteers might be an opportunity for some personal growth, as well as management for volunteers. So maybe this can help save you some time and really fine-tune where you need to be spending your time learning about managing volunteers. So here's a preview of what we're going to learn during this session. One of the big things is learning what personal and organizational readiness is and how to evaluate your personal readiness, as well as identify opportunities within your county volunteer major program to increase organizational readiness. Now, I was an agent for over a decade before I learned what personal readiness was. And to be honest, I would often skip over this topic because I already felt I was ready. I didn't necessarily understand all the components of personal readiness. So if you're still watching, you're doing better than I did. And so it's really about within the volunteer context, it's about an individual's preparedness, their skills, and most importantly, their mindset necessary to effectively lead and support volunteers. And this includes everything from understanding and embodying a personal philosophy for volunteers, as well as staying informed about trends and technologies in volunteer management and advocating for the value of volunteer engagement. Now, occasionally I will hear people in our organization make statements like, well, managing volunteers is not a good return on investment. It takes too much time and energy to manage volunteers. And as part of our strategic planning process, I've even heard people question whether a volunteer delivery model is cost effective or even relevant here in the 21st century. And I completely understand where they're coming from. Managing volunteers can be challenging, especially if you don't have the support, the knowledge, the skills, the experience, and the tools to do it. However, the research says that volunteers are not only worth it, but they strengthen the 4-H program more than we ever could on our own as paid employees. So if we are objective, the research can help shape our mindset and our beliefs about volunteers, and that's key when it comes to personal readiness. Now, typically people only think about volunteer value in terms of increasing the reach and organizational capacity, and that is certainly true. In fact, some studies have said that incorporating volunteers in your program can increase your reach by up to 50%. Another key finding, and this was validated by some of the research that Dr. Julie Dillard and I did in 2023 here in the Northwest District, our volunteers increase our organizational capacity by making connections on behalf of the 4-H organization. So we found that our volunteers up here in the Panhandle, they on average make 11 new connections with community partners on behalf of 4-H. And they spend about 13 hours a month working directly with youth. And that on average, the number of youth they work with is 23. So if you had 10 volunteers and they're making 11 new connections, that's quite a few connections in the community besides what you would physically be able to do by yourself. And same with with youth reach. So that is definitely one of the benefits, but it's not the only one. Another really big one is your program quality and fidelity. And so we find that volunteers, they serve as a vital link between the program theory and outcome achievement in 4-H. And one study done here in Florida found that up to 50% of the life skills that youth learn in 4-H is because of volunteers, that volunteers are responsible for that. So that is also important. But they also have a major impact on youth development. So if you think about the 4-H Thrive model, which guides our program, it's really important. Volunteers play a critical role in creating developmental contexts. And this contributes to youth thriving and long-term success. So we're specifically talking about creating that sense of belonging, helping them discover their sparks and explore their sparks, youth-adult partnerships, and those supportive relationships with adults and peers. So volunteers help us do that in a huge way. They also help strengthen the public value of 4-H. And so, volunteer engagement in 4-H programs really fosters community connections and enhances the program's public value. They also help provide sustainability. And so the National Framework for 4-H Volunteerism emphasizes that when systems are in place to support volunteers, they remain engaged even when the program experiences turnover. So by involving volunteers and adapting your programs to shifts in volunteer engagement patterns, we can maintain and enhance sustainability, and that's a win-win for everyone there. Now, you may not be a big fan of reading the research, and that's okay. I have created an annotated bibliography of all of these studies, so you have each study is cited, and then some of the key findings are summarized for you, as well as some implications that can help support your practice. And so this is a handy tool, especially for 4-H faculty. You can cite these studies when you are writing your extension program narratives, when you are writing impact statements, when you are writing grant narratives. This can be a valuable tool to help justify the time that you spent leading and managing volunteers. And like anything else, volunteer engagement and management is constantly being influenced by society, the economy, politics, and technology. And so here's just a couple of examples in case you're not aware. Researchers have found that volunteers are preferring shorter roles. They want roles that are meaningful to them and roles that are flexible. Now, this doesn't mean we can't find longer-term volunteers, but it does mean that we might need to take a step back and offer some shorter-term roles, especially for new volunteers. And so often this quality short-term experience can lead to a longer-term commitment. And we also see this with youth. They might start off coming to a day camp or participating in an embryology program, and then their spark has been lit and they are ready to come back and do more 4-H. So it works with volunteers as well. We also see in the research, ironically enough, that even when the economy is in decline, people are still willing to serve and to give. And so out of all these factors, the economy probably has the least impact on trends in volunteering. And I think that says a lot of good things about humankind. Politics. When the election doesn't go the way someone wants it to, they often use volunteering to make a difference when they feel their vote did not. And so you may see a flush of new volunteer recruits after a polarizing election. So keep an eye out for that. Technology, out of all these things, I think technology has probably impacted volunteering the most, at least during my career. And we now have technology to tackle many volunteer administrative tasks. Things like recruitment, communication, training, and here in the Northwest District, we've even used social media to recognize volunteers. Legislation is the intersection between society and politics. And so in the context of volunteering, society petitioned the government for more legislation regarding youth protection and volunteer screening. And so in 2010, both state and federal legislation was passed that impacted our screening and selection processes for volunteers here in Florida. So one way to stay up to date on trends and volunteering is to read the annual report that's published by Volunteer Match. It's online, it's free to read and download, and it is comprehensive across all volunteer organizations in North America. And often they also offer a webinar that kind of gives an overview of what they've found. So that's a great, easy way to stay up to date with trends. And so now that you've learned or been reminded of what the research says behind why volunteers are a good investment and some of the trends that are influencing their service, you are ready to begin forming your own volunteer philosophy. Now, this may sound like an unnecessary step, but it's not. Taking the time to think about and to write down your own philosophy is critical. It can help guide your total program, making sure that it's aligned with our 4-H mission and your personal values. So this is especially helpful if you are a faculty member and are required to report annually on your volunteer major program. Now, I've tried to make it as easy as possible with a template and an example that you can download and use. And I thought, a few years ago, I developed my own personal volunteer philosophy to guide my work as a 4-H RSA to support you and our Northwest volunteers. And so it is posted as a video or a reel on our district's social media, but this is the one that I developed, and this is kind of what I go back to when I'm planning programs for staff and faculty who manage volunteers or for volunteers themselves, in case you're interested. Now, the last component of personal readiness is really all about advocating for volunteer engagement. And instead of just telling you what you need to do this, I am going to give you some practical strategies and a few tools that you can use. So one of the strategies is to share stories. And so using personal success stories of volunteers to illustrate their contributions can really inspire others and move them to want to volunteer. It can also increase public value. So I've included a success story template to help you identify and craft a success story. And not only is this a great strategy for advocating for volunteers, it also supports our annual reporting process if you're a faculty member. So that's a 2-for-1. Another strategy is to engage your stakeholders. So this is great. And I've got a couple of tools to help you with that. One is the advocacy card and a flyer. I have lots of the cards printed, but I will give you access to the file that you can download and customize if you want. But the card is a business-sized card. They're great to just keep in a wallet or a purse. I would share them with your advisory committee members or other people who may not be leading clubs, but they still believe in the value of 4-H programming. And so you never know when you're going to have an opportunity to talk to someone about being a volunteer. And so the card on the back of it has 3 or 4 really good talking points so that you don't have to keep your elevator speech memorized. So it's just a handy dandy tool that is easy to use. I also have a elevator speech template if you want. Public recognition is another great way to advocate for volunteers. And so not all volunteers want public recognition, but it is good to recognize them so people are aware that you have a volunteer program. And so you can do this through awards, events, or social media campaigns. We do one here in the Northwest District to highlight the value of volunteers and their contributions. And so we are going to have a session in this series specifically on volunteer recognition because that was one of the topics you requested. But for now, I'm going to include a fact sheet on year-round recognition ideas to help inspire you. But know that we're going to come back to this and go into recognition in much more detail later in the series. Another strategy that's really easy, you just have to get in the habit of doing it, is education. So making sure that you're equipping staff, volunteers, and other community members with information on why volunteer engagement is vital. So you can start doing this at your next staff meeting, in your county office, but then also with other groups that you interact with. Anytime you go speak to a different group, have a standard slide in your presentation about the value of volunteer engagement and why it's important. And just build that into your presentation anytime you speak. Also, another thing that might help is the fact sheet on the study that Dr. Julie Dillard and I did together that helped document and quantify the impact that volunteers have here in the Northwest District. So those are several strategies and tools that you can download and use in a practical way to begin advocating for volunteer engagement. So now we want to move on to organizational readiness. It is actually different from personal readiness, and it focuses more on the systems that you have set up at the county level to support volunteers. So, like I said, this refers to the structures, the policies, and the environment that an organization, and when I say that, you at the county level, your county extension office, establishes to effectively recruit, support, and retain volunteers. So this is everything from fostering a positive culture and process for volunteer engagement, assessing and addressing the need for volunteers, and then developing clear and thoughtful volunteer roles. So assessing the climate, there's lots of different ways you can do this. The one that I'm going to suggest that you start with is to use a checklist. So I have a climate checklist that you can download and you can fill out. You might even ask, your CED, your program assistant to help you do it. And this gives you a really good baseline for where you are currently as a county organization. It also kind of gives you some direction on areas you might want to work on. A couple of other ways, you're going to want to use a mix of qualitative and quantitative data to really plan your programs. And so this is important, especially if you're a 4-H faculty member, because we have to report on these things. So you need to collect the data anyway. Why not just use these tools? And it can double as a strategy to help with organizational readiness. So that is a win-win, a 2-for-1. I love that. So a couple of tools that can help you do that. One is a volunteer satisfaction survey. And we're going to talk more about this when we get to evaluation, which is another thing that you requested later on in the series. But there's also a volunteer feedback discussion guide. So yes, we interview volunteers at the start of their service, but it's good, if you can't do it every year, do it every couple of years, to sit down at the end of the 4-H year and have a discussion with your 4-H volunteer. This is a great time to find out what their successes were for your report, what the challenges are for your plan of work for next year, but then also to really help guide your program and find out, do they want to volunteer next year? That's important as well. And then a third thing that we really haven't done, and it's controversial in some districts, is to really leverage the data from retention rates, because there's a lot of science that backs up why retention is important. So let's dig into this a little bit more. If you're not familiar, and again, we're going to go into more depth when we get to the evaluation session for this series. But nationwide, volunteer organizations have about a 65% retention rate for their volunteers. Now here in Florida, it's higher, which is great. It's 69%. But know that different types of volunteer programs have different retention rates. Those first two statistics are just an average of all volunteer organizations, not necessarily youth-serving organizations. Rates are also influenced by age and gender. And the reason it's important is the cost of replacing a volunteer has been estimated to be around $1,200, especially if they're a seasoned volunteer. So it takes a lot of time to identify and recruit and onboard and train a new volunteer. It takes a lot of money to screen them, right? It's around $100. So it is worth it to retain them at least for a few years if you can. And it is also a sign of a quality program, because retention is linked to volunteer satisfaction and motivation. So if you're doing a really good job with your volunteer program, you're going to have higher retention rates. So it is an outcome indicator of program quality. And that is why I advocate for using this data in your reporting. Now, we do have a simple spreadsheet if you want to start calculating this and tracking this. Unfortunately, there's not a report in 4-H Online that will do this for us, but there's a very simple formula to do that. And so for your tools, I'm going to include a volunteer retention tracking form, as well as an annotated bibliography, again, on the volunteer retention research. So if you get questions, why are you doing this? Well, then you have all of the studies that say why this is important and why it's meaningful and how it's an indicator of program quality. So hopefully that will help. It's really not controversial here in the Northwest, so I don't think you'll have any issues. The second step, or the second component of organizational readiness, is identifying the need for volunteers. And this is really going to be the focus of next month's series. It's all about identifying volunteers. So I'm not going to really go into it with this video because we're going to do that next month. But know that there is going to be some overlap between some of these topics, and that's okay. So the last component of organizational readiness is developing the roles to meet those needs. And so for most of you, especially if you're in the building stage, I don't think you're going to need to create new volunteer descriptions. We have standard volunteer descriptions that are available on our website, but I'll also include them in the downloads. And I think there's 5 roles. And so some of them are long-term, some of them are short-term. So things like being a club leader or a co-leader, a project leader, and a chaperone, those typically do require level 2 screening, and they are a longer-term commitment. But we also have shorter-term roles like advisory committee members, foundation board members, school or after-school staff, things like that. Now, you may have some specialized roles depending on your program. You might want to have middle manager volunteers, and that might be someone to help recruit new volunteers. You might have volunteers that help you run a fair, if you have a fair in your county, or judges for different events, whether it be the fair or public speaking. Sometimes you just have volunteers who don't want to run a club, but they're happy to share their knowledge and expertise or their talent. So they might serve as a guest speaker or an MC for a big event, or maybe they audit the books on your county association, and they provide other services. So I would start, if you're starting out, just start with the basic 5 that we have. Don't worry about creating specialized roles, but there is a template if you have a need for creating a specialized role, and that would all be justified by the step before this, which is identifying the need. So there's going to be lots of different strategies to do that we'll talk about next month. A couple of other resources that we have that you may not be aware of is we have 2 really good videos that were done by one of our former 4-H agents. One is on adult volunteer roles in 4-H, and the other one is on teen volunteer roles in 4-H. So if you're not using those videos, you should, because they're good, they're short, they're simple, and easy to share on social media, email, however. okay. And they would be great too when you're advocating for volunteers. Use those as well for advocating. Now, as we wrap it up, I thought it'd be good to talk about some of the similarities, the differences, and how personal readiness and organizational readiness really complement each other. So, both personal and organizational readiness, they focus on creating a foundation for successful volunteer engagement. They both require intentionality and reflection and planning to align all of those efforts with those goals. And they both emphasize the importance of adapting to changing trends and needs in your county program. Now, some of the ways they're different, personal readiness is really about your individual beliefs, your skills, your knowledge, while organizational readiness is about systems, policies, culture, that kind of thing. Things that you may not directly control, but you can influence sometimes. Personal readiness also involves a lot of self-awareness and professional growth, whereas organizational readiness really involves building and creating infrastructure and support for volunteer engagement. So that's how they're similar and different. But they really together help create that environment where volunteers feel valued, they feel supported and motivated to contribute to our mission in 4-H. And that's how we get retention, is when they are feeling valued, supported, and motivated. So hopefully this has helped. I appreciate you watching. Here's a QR code if you don't mind filling out the feedback form. And when you have completed the form, you will be redirected to a website that has all of the tools that I've talked about today so that you can begin using those to strengthen your volunteer program. And I will see you next time.